The air in room 207 at Westwood Middle School in Cleveland, Ohio, was thick with a familiar indifference. Seventh graders shuffled to their seats, their conversations fading into murmurs as the clock ticked toward the start of math class. Most students considered this period a chore, a time to daydream or doodle on the edges of their worksheets. Near the back of the room sat Ellie Bennett, her slender frame hunched over her desk. With her head bowed low, her pencil tapped a quiet rhythm against the wooden surface, a sound lost amid the rustling of papers and whispers. Ellie had always been a shadow in the classroom, a master of fading into the background. She didn't raise her hand, didn't chatter with friends, and didn't draw attention to herself in any way. Her peers saw her as ordinary. Teachers often overlooked her, assuming her silence was a sign of mediocrity. But Ellie's mind was a world apart. While others saw her as invisible, she had a secret life within her notebooks, one filled with complex equations and advanced problems far beyond her grade level. She would scrawl solutions in the margins, working through challenges she found in old library books. Math wasn't just a subject to Ellie. It was her passion, her escape. At the front of the room, Miss Parker, the school's notoriously strict math teacher, stood with a posture that demanded attention. At 42, she had spent nearly 2 decades cultivating a reputation for her sharp tongue and unyielding standards. She was the kind of teacher students either feared or grudgingly respected, but one thing was certain: she didn't tolerate laziness. "This," Miss Parker announced, holding up a worksheet like it was evidence in a trial, "is basic algebra." Basic. Her voice sliced through the chatter, and the room fell silent. Her heels clacked against the tile as she paced, her eyes scanning the rows of slumped shoulders and blank stares. "We've been working on this for weeks. Weeks. And yet half of you are still getting it wrong." She slapped the worksheet onto her desk, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "What is it going to take for you all to care?" Ellie stayed motionless, her pencil hovering mid-air. She wasn't afraid of Miss Parker, not exactly, but she had no desire to become the target of her frustration. Keeping her head down had served her well so far, and she had no intention of breaking that pattern today. But Miss Parker was on a mission. Her gaze swept the room like a searchlight, pausing briefly on each student. The class collectively held its breath, praying they wouldn't be the ones singled out. And then, her eyes landed on Ellie. "Miss Bennett," Miss Parker said, her tone sharp and commanding. Ellie's stomach lurched. Slowly, she raised her head, her cheeks burning as the weight of 30 pairs of eyes shifted toward her. "You've been awfully quiet back there," Miss Parker continued, a slight smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Let's see if you've been paying attention." Ellie swallowed hard, her voice barely audible as she forced herself to respond. "Yes, ma'am." But Miss Parker wasn't finished. She strode to the board, grabbed a piece of chalk, and began to write. The equation she scrawled stretched across the board in a maze of symbols, exponents, and variables that looked like it belonged in a college lecture hall. A ripple of gasps and murmurs spread through the classroom. Students exchanged wide-eyed glances, their faces a mixture of confusion and relief that they weren't the ones being put on the spot. "Solve it," Miss Parker said, stepping back with her arms crossed. Her smirk widened as she leaned against her desk, clearly expecting Ellie to falter. For a moment, Ellie froze. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the whispers around her grew louder, sharper. "She's not going to get that," someone muttered. "No way," another voice added, followed by a stifled laugh. Ellie gripped her pencil tightly, her knuckles turning white. Panic threatened to consume her, but then something shifted. Deep down, beneath the fear and the self-doubt, a quiet voice emerged. "You can do this." Asterisk. It wasn't confidence that drove Ellie to her feet, but something stronger. A determination that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Slowly, she stood, her chair scraping against the floor. The room went silent, all eyes fixed on her as she made her way to the front of the class. Miss Parker raised an eyebrow, her smirk unchanging. "Any time now," she said, her tone laced with sarcasm. "Or do you need a calculator?" The class chuckled, but Ellie barely heard them. She reached for the chalk, her fingers brushing against its cold surface. The board loomed before her, the equation a labyrinth of challenges waiting to be unraveled. Ellie took a deep breath. Her mind, which had been racing moments ago, began to slow. The equation wasn't an obstacle, it was a puzzle. And puzzles were what she loved most. She raised the chalk and began to write. The first marks Ellie made on the board were hesitant, her movements deliberate as if testing the waters. The classroom remained eerily quiet, the faint hum of the overhead lights serving as the only backdrop to the sound of chalk scratching against the surface. At first, the students watched with detached curiosity, some leaning forward to catch a glimpse of what she was doing. But as Ellie continued, something changed. The randomness of her initial strokes began to form a pattern. Numbers and symbols flowed seamlessly together, her handwriting precise and controlled. What had initially seemed like an impossible puzzle started to take shape, each step building upon the last with undeniable logic. The class was transfixed. Even the usual troublemakers, who thrived on disrupting moments like this, were silent, their eyes bouncing between Ellie and the board. Miss Parker, still leaning against her desk, uncrossed her arms. Her smirk faded into a faint frown, her eyes narrowing as she examined Ellie's work. Slowly, she rose to her feet and stepped closer to the board, her heels clicking softly against the tiles. Ellie didn't notice. She was in her element now, her mind working faster than her hand as it raced across the board. To her, the equation was no longer daunting. Each variable, exponent, and fraction was just another piece of the puzzle she was determined to solve. As she worked, the whispers began. "Wait, is she actually solving that?" one student muttered. "How does she know what to do?" whispered another, their tone tinged with awe. "She's a freaking genius," a voice breathed, loud enough for Ellie to hear. Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't stop. The equation grew more complex as she neared the final steps, each one demanding a higher level of precision. Ellie paused briefly, her chalk hovering just above the board, as she double-checked her mental calculations. Then, with a quick flick of her wrist, she wrote the final answer and circled it with a bold, confident line. She turned to face the class, her breathing steady but her hands trembling slightly. Her chalk-dusted fingers clutched the edge of her jeans as she waited for some kind of response. The silence was deafening. Miss Parker stepped closer to the board, her eyes scanning Ellie's work with the intensity of a detective scrutinizing evidence. She traced the equation with her finger, muttering under her breath as she checked each line. Finally, she straightened and turned to face Ellie, her expression unreadable. "This is correct," she said, her voice soft but filled with something uncharacteristic, genuine astonishment. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room, followed by a smattering of applause. It started slowly, a hesitant clap or two from the back of the class, but it grew louder, more confident, until nearly every student was clapping. Ellie's face burned as she looked down, her hands clasped tightly together. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, and part of her longed to shrink back into the safety of her seat. But another part, a small, unfamiliar part, felt something different. Pride. Miss Parker raised her hand, silencing the applause. Her eyes were still on Ellie, filled with a mix of curiosity and respect. "Miss Bennett," she began, her tone firm but lacking its usual sharpness, "how did you know how to solve this?" Ellie hesitated, unsure of how to explain. I've been studying," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Studying?" Miss Parker repeated, her eyebrows rising. Ellie nodded. "At the library. I like math. It makes sense to me." The class exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and admiration. This wasn't the Ellie they thought they knew, the quiet girl who always stayed in the background. Miss Parker's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze never leaving Ellie's face. "Why haven't you spoken up before? If you're capable of this, why haven't you shown it?" Ellie swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her notebook. "I didn't think anyone would care," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Miss Parker's expression softened, and for the first time, she looked less like the stern taskmaster and more like someone who genuinely wanted to understand. "Well," she said after a long pause, "you were wrong about that." The bell rang, breaking the tension and signaling the end of class. Students began packing their things, but their eyes lingered on Ellie as they shuffled out of the room. Whispers followed her, soft, amazed snippets of conversation. "She's like a genius," someone said. "I can't believe she did that," another added. Ellie clutched her notebook tightly, her heart racing. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and she wasn't sure she liked it. "Ellie," Miss Parker called out as the last students left the room. "Can you stay for a moment?" Ellie froze, her hand halfway to her bag. Slowly, she turned back, her stomach twisting with nerves. Miss Parker gestured for her to come closer, her expression thoughtful. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Ellie blinked. "An apology?" Miss Parker nodded. "I underestimated you. I assumed you were just coasting through my class, but I see now that I was wrong. You're extraordinary, Ellie, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Ellie didn't know what to say. No teacher had ever spoken to her like this before, not as a student, but as a person. Miss Parker continued, her tone more confident. "You have a gift, Ellie, and it's not just about solving equations. It's about the way you think, the way you approach problems. That's something rare, and it's something you shouldn't hide." Ellie looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edges of her notebook. "I just didn't think it mattered," she said softly. "It matters," Miss Parker said firmly. "It matters a lot, and I want to help you, if you'll let me. There are programs, competitions, opportunities that could challenge you in ways you've never imagined. I think you'd be incredible." Ellie's heart raced at the thought of stepping out of her comfort zone. It terrified her, but it also excited her in a way she didn't fully understand. "I'll think about it," she said quietly, a small smile tugging at her lips. Miss Parker smiled back. "That's all I ask." As Ellie left the classroom, the world felt a little different. For the first time, she wondered not what she could hide but what she could become.